In local matters, speculation over whether Secretary of State Mike Pompeo would launch a 2020 Senate bid is officially over. That's because the filing deadline to be a candidate in Kansas passed earlier this week. Pompeo is a former congressman from the state. Many Republicans, including Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, said he would have been a strong candidate to fill an open seat there. Now, some Republicans are reportedly worried about a crowded primary. That includes concerns over Kris Kobach, the controversial former Kansas Secretary of State who has launched a campaign. For more, let's bring in Bryan Lowry. He's the lead political reporter for the Kansas City Star. Bryan, thanks very much for being with us. So Kris Kobach lost the state's gubernatorial race in 2018 by 5 percentage points to Democratic Governor Laura Kelly. What are his chances of winning the Republican nomination in Kansas?
They're high. Any polls that have shown that it's really a race between Kris Kobach and Roger Marshall, the congressman who represents Western Kansas.
And tell us a little bit more about Roger Marshall. And are there others who are seen as challengers who might be strong against Kobach?
It's really between these two guys. Kobach obviously has a lot of name recognition as a former statewide official, a kind of mainstay on cable news. Marshall is an OBGYN. He represents the western half of the state. He represents the same congressional district that Bob Dole once had. And his base is farmers. That's really what his campaign has been centered on. And his pitch is that he's essentially the slow and steady candidate, and that he can essentially keep the seat, which Republicans have controlled since the 1930s.
So you call him the slow and steady candidate. Is there any sense among Republicans what it is that they're looking for? That kind of slow and steady candidate, or someone like a Kris Kobach, who is a regular face that you see on cable news?
There's been a long-term divide in Kansas politics between moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans. Kris Kobach definitely appeals to a certain segment in the party that wants a bomb thrower. But traditionally, Kansas has gone with guys like Jerry Moran and Pat Roberts, these guys who are very focused on agricultural issues and aren't really controversial figures. So Kobach would be a real departure for the state in terms of Senate candidates.
Let's zoom out just a little bit. There are some fears that among GOP leaders that this reliably Republican stronghold could become an expensive battleground for control of the Senate. Explain how fundraising is playing a role in all of this.
Well, this is actually a huge fact that the Democrat, Barbara Bollier, leads the field in fundraising. That's very rare in Kansas. Now, Kansas isn't as expensive as states on the coast to run a campaign, but the fact that Barbara Bollier has well over $2 million in her bank account, Roger Marshall is close to that, and Kris Kobach is really struggling to fundraise. He doesn't do well with the types of guys who write big checks. That's got national Republican groups very concerned because if Kobach's the nominee, they're going to have to start spending a lot of money that they'd like to put into North Carolina and Colorado. There is another candidate in this race, Bob Hamilton. You just had his photo on the screen. He had founded a plumbing company in Kansas, and he's self-funding. He gave himself a $2 million loan when he entered the race in March. So that's the question: is who is the candidate who can have the resources that Republicans need to hold on to this reliably GOP seat in the fall?
Let's talk about Barbara Bollier. I mean, it's an interesting background here. A former Republican hoping to become the first Democrat elected to the U.S. Senate from Kansas since 1932. How is she running her campaign?
She's very much emphasizing her medical background. She's a retired anesthesiologist. We're in a pandemic. Healthcare was always going to be an important issue, but it is the focal point for Bollier, who has been the face of maybe the Medicaid expansion movement in Kansas for quite some time. And she's a moderate. She is very much a centrist. She was always a moderate Republican who broke with the party leadership quite a bit. And in fact, Kris Kobach's campaign for governor is what precipitated her departure from the party. She had endorsed Laura Kelly in that race, and then after Kelly won the general election in 2018, Bollier announced that she was switching parties. So she's very much a candidate who is geared at winning suburban swing voters in the state and could give Democrats their most competitive shot at this seat in decades.
Really intriguing dynamics playing out. We'll keep an eye on it. Bryan Lowry. Bryan, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.